4 days before the union budget and less than 90 days before the general elections, Congress President Rahul Gandhi has made a big promise. Speaking at a rally in Chhattisgarh, thanking farmers after the party's resounding election victory in December, Rahul Gandhi has promised a minimum income support for the poor if voted to power, claiming that a new India cannot be built when millions suffer the scourge of poverty. Gandhi said that the Congress is committed to eradicating hunger. It is important to note that Rahul Gandhi has promised a minimum income guarantee and not a universal basic income, at least not on the face of it. That was an idea first mooted by the former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam in the Economic Survey, and it argues for a uniform stipend for all citizens and not just the poor. Before we bring on our guests to decode the promise made by Rahul Gandhi, here's the man himself making that promise just a few hours ago at a rally in Chhattisgarh. Listen in.
हम दो हिंदुस्तान नहीं चाहते हैं, एक हिंदुस्तान होगा और उस हिंदुस्तान में हर गरीब व्यक्ति को मिनिमम इनकम देने का काम कांग्रेस पार्टी की सरकार करेगी। और ये काम आज तक दुनिया की किसी सरकार ने नहीं किया है। ये काम दुनिया में सबसे पहले हिंदुस्तान की 2019 के बाद कांग्रेस वाली सरकार करने जा रही है।
Well, that is Rahul Gandhi making that promise of a minimum income guarantee. Joining us now to discuss this further, Surjit Bhalla, Chairman of Oxis Investments, former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Pranab Sen, the former Chief Statistician of India, and we will be joined by more guests in a short while from now. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. Surjit Bhalla, let me start by asking you, on the face of it, and I say on the face of it because we don't have too many details as of now. All we have is that soundbite from Rahul Gandhi's rally, but he clearly says that it is going to be a minimum income guarantee targeted at the poor. Now, if I look at the economic survey of 16-17, the idea then presented by the former Chief Economic Advisor said, and I quote, "It is important that the universal basic income is not framed as a transfer payment from the rich to the poor. Its basis is rather different. The UBI gives concrete expression to the idea that we have a right to a minimum income merely by virtue of being citizens. So UBI must indeed be universal, unconditional, and involve direct transfers." The Congress's promise seems to be smaller in scope and scale.
Look, the idea of a minimum income, first of all, let me state that it was a very comprehensive study by Arvind Subramaniam in the economic survey by this government on universal basic income. Second, that I disagreed with universal basic income then and have disagreed since. What I do believe what India needs is a minimum income guarantee, and a substantial portions of it are already in place, brought in by this government. It is an old, Pranab will also enlighten you, that this has been an old debate in economic circles, in policy circles, and actually it is a Bhagwati versus Amartya Sen debate. Amartya Sen believes, and probably still believes, that poverty should be alleviated by direct action, i.e. food subsidy programs, Narega programs, Employment Guarantee Acts programs, and the opposite view, which I fully subscribe to, is that we have the technology and all the wherewithal, and we should do it in forms of direct transfer of income. The Jan Dhan program started 2 years ago, does precisely that. Now the scale of it, and then I may also enlighten or say that, I've written detailed papers on it, including about a month ago, on what should be a minimum income guarantee. So this is, on the face of it, this looks like the government has just announced a minimum income guarantee for the farmers, and Mr. Rahul Gandhi must have thought, I must try and take away the discussion from the TV channels.
Surjit Bhalla, but Surjit Bhalla, the government actually hasn't announced the minimum guarantee just yet. They're contemplating that, and the assumption is that they will make that announcement in the vote on account, but they haven't announced it yet.
Yeah. No, Shireen, I said a minimum income for the farmers has been announced, not a
Yes.
minimum income guarantee for all poor citizens.
Not at a
that
national
was
level.
announced maybe 2 hours before.
Even for
Rahul Gandhi.
farmers.
I see.
But where is this announcement come in?
I read it on where everybody reads this news is on WhatsApp. So maybe that hasn't been announced as yet. But be that as it
you know, we need to be careful about what we pick up on WhatsApp, because
Correct.
there has been no official announcement to our knowledge at this point in time of the government announcing a minimum support scheme for farmers. But let me get the former CSO Pranab Sen in on this conversation as well. Dr. Sen, thanks very much. As Surjit Bhalla pointed out, this is not a new argument. This was an idea that was brought back to the table in the 16-17 economic survey by the chief economic advisor, where he was clear that it needs to be universal, it needs to be unconditional, and it needs to involve direct transfers. But at the same time, in terms of implementation, the thought was also to do away with some of the existing subsidies, food, fertilizer, for instance. What is your take on the promise being made by Rahul Gandhi and the likelihood of the government following through, and what would you like to see?
Well, let me put it this way. You know, I'm perfectly with Surjit that I am not a great votary of a truncated UBI. For the very simple reason, you know, the moment you minimum income for the poor, it immediately lands you into the question of who is the poor. Anybody, both Surjit and I have worked extensively on poverty, and both of us are acutely aware that if you go to any Indian village or you go to any Indian slum and you ask the question that who are the 10 poorest households in this area, everybody will agree.
Yeah.
But if you ask them who is the poor, they'll say all of us. Now, the moment you start getting into that we shall give it to the poor, then we are raising the age-old issue of targeting, in which we have been spectacularly unsuccessful. That's number one. Number two is you need to be also very, very clear as to who is the target. Is it the individual or is it the household? Because you think of a country like India, we have an average family size of 4.8 people. That varies from single-person households to joint families which have 15, 20 people in them. Do you have the same amount that goes to each of those? Because if you don't, then what you're doing is really disrupting an age-old, tried and proven system of mutual insurance, which is what joint families are. You're essentially saying that your insurance doesn't amount to much. Now, these are fundamental sociological changes, and we need to be very careful before we start disturbing them in any significant way.
Right. In fact, again, we don't have the details, but for the benefit of our viewers, the Rangarajan Committee, just to address the point that was raised there by Dr. Pranab Sen, the Rangarajan Committee, which was set up to look into poverty line estimation in India, submitted its report in June of 2014. It amended the calculation of the poverty line based on per capita consumption expenditure per month or a day given by the Tendulkar Committee, and it arrived at a number, basically, for the census by about 5,000 rupees per household. That was the definition of poor. But let me go across to Salman Soaz now and get a point of view from the Congress, because it is the promise that's been made by Rahul Gandhi. Salman Soaz, you know, short on detail, what is the idea? Is this going to be an add-on? Does this replace existing subsidies? How do you classify the poor? What are we talking about in terms of the impact as far as the fisc is concerned? Is it 3% of GDP, 4% of GDP? What are we talking about?
Thanks, Shireen. You know, the idea is obviously this is not a universal basic income. This is a targeted basic income for the poor. I know Mr. Sen, he's a very reputable economist. I respect him a lot, and I know he has genuine concerns. But, you know, let me quote from a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Committee, Surjit Bhalla, who wrote actually about targeted basic income, and basically said that it would be a political and economic masterstroke would the union budget to contain a basic income scheme for the bottom 50%. So I don't really think, I know we've been talking about universal basic income or some variant of that. So this is not something that is, in some ways, there has been discourse about this. I think India has a lot of experience in trying to figure out how to target beneficiaries. Now we have direct benefit transfer. So we have lots of possibilities here. The main thing that I want to draw your attention to is that in India, social protection spending is very low compared to its comparator nations, even in Asia. Forget the rest of the world. We've not been spending enough on the most basic things. And, if you have almost 40% kids who are stunted, what kind of productivity will you have from them when they grow up? They do not do well in school. When they grow up, they're not productive members of society. They're unable to find the kinds of jobs that they need. So we need to have something for these people so that they're not left behind. I think this is a very welcome step. And I think Surjit, I don't know if he's on your program, he would be more than happy to explain to you the fiscal impact. By the way, Surjit Bhalla has actually done a calculation based on targeting 50% of the population. It comes to about 2% of GDP. And I don't think Surjit was saying that it is a bad thing. In fact, he was very supportive of this concept.
I'll get to Surjit Bhalla in just a second, who's nodding his head vigorously, but I also want to go across to the former Finance Minister, Mr. P Chidambaram, who joins us. Mr. Chidambaram, many thanks for joining us on the program, sir. As I pointed out, on the face of it, it doesn't look like this is a carry forward of the idea presented by Arvind Subramaniam in the Economic Survey of 1617, which basically proposed a universal basic income. This is a minimum guarantee targeted at the poor. Several questions, sir. How is the classification going to be done? What is going to be the fiscal impact? Is this an add-on? Does it do away with existing subsidies, which was the recommendation of the IMF as well? Can you explain to us what is the thought process?
Why are we bringing the IMF and others into this? Are we not competent to do our own thinking and come to our own conclusions? As I said in my tweet, we are adapting the idea of universal basic income to our situation and to our needs. Let's assume that 20% of India are the very poor, the poorest. And we must find a way in which that 20% families are assured an annual income at a minimum level, at a level where they will have enough food, enough clothes, a roof over their head, can send their children to school, can access health care. That is the absolute minimum in a civilized society. And I think that's eminently doable. You can call it by whatever name you want, but in my view, it is an adaptation of the principle of universal basic income in accordance with our needs and our situation to meet the needs of the very poor of India.
Okay. So when you talk about this being an adaptation of the idea for universal basic income, Mr. Chidambaram, can you explain to us how this is going to be executed, how this is going to be implemented if indeed your government were to come to power to take this through? What is it going to mean in terms of the impact as far as the fisc is concerned? I mean, and I'm only trying to understand what it would actually mean in terms of the income transfer in an individual bank account or in a household's bank account. If you look at the Minimum Wages Act, it's what, about 160 rupees a day, which is guaranteed. Explain to us how this is going to work.
It will be through a transfer of money to families, the poorest families of India. The Minimum Wages Act will apply only to in employment in the organized sector. Developed countries do exactly what I'm saying by periodically increasing the minimum wage. America does it. But that's because most employment there, almost 100% employment, is in the organized sector. Our employment is in the unorganized sector. The bulk of them are in rural India, but a very large number is in urban slums. Therefore, the target is the family, the poorest families, and the mode is to transfer money to those families so that the family will have a minimum income. I think it's doable within our, consistent with the fiscal situation. Calculations have been made. Dr. Arvind Subramanian, for example, has calculated a UBI to be 1.5% of GDP. Others have made the calculation. I think the way we are approaching the problem, namely wiping out poverty as the goal, it's eminently doable. We are a large economy, given the size of our GDP, given the size of our annual expenditure, we can do it.
Let me just get you to comment on that, because you brought up the economic survey presented by Subramaniam. I'm quoting from that. He says that a UBI that reduces poverty to 0.5% would cost anywhere between 4 to 5% of GDP, assuming that those in the top 25% income bracket do not participate. On the other hand, the existing middle-class subsidies and food, petroleum and fertilizer subsidies cost about 3% of GDP. So your adaptation of the Subramaniam idea or the universal basic income idea is much more specifically targeted. So what is your calculation telling you? You said don't talk about the IMF, but the IMF, basis the economic survey, had worked out a number of about 2,600 rupees at 11, 12 prices. What is the calculation you're working with?
Shireen, we are not talking about the top 25%. We're not talking about the middle class either.
I said that.
I said that. The poorest.
I said exactly that.
So what is the size of the poor? So I'm only drawing attention to calculations which have been made on different assumptions with different goals. But given our goal, namely that the poorest in India will be brought up to a level of minimum income, you will agree with me, it will be much less than the calculations made by Dr. Arvind Subramanian and others. So it's doable.
Okay. And
we are targeting, say, the poorest. And let's assume for the sake of this argument, let's assume for the sake of this conversation, that the poorest are 20% of India. We are targeting them. That's why I emphasize the word adapt the principle of universal basic income. It's not a universal basic income. A universal basic income will give an amount to you and to me. We're not talking about that. We're adapting the principle in order to ensure that the poorest of India, say 20% or so, whatever the number is, are brought to a level of minimum income.
Okay, so important clarifications coming in there from you, that you're targeting families, you're targeting only the poorest of the poor families. If I could get more clarification, and hence the number of 3 to 4% or 4 to 5% of GDP, which was the estimation of Arvind Subramaniam, it will be much lower if you go through with this. Other questions that I want to ask, sir, how do you propose this? Is it going to be split between the centre and the state? Is this likely to take a shape, for instance, as we have done with the GST? How will this work? Is that how you intend it to be?
You see, these are questions we will answer when we are in government. But that's a choice that the people have to make. If the people make that choice, and when we are in government, we firmly believe that we must carry the states in any national program, national scheme. Obviously, we'll invite all the states to join in this effort, and I believe no state will say no. No state will say that the poorest of India should not be brought up to a level of income where poverty is practically wiped out. And I think we can secure the cooperation of all the states and then find ways in which the burden can be shared. Well, I don't want to use the burden. It's an obligation that has to be shared. And I'm sure we'll find ways in which the obligation can be shared. But the initiative will be from the central government, and the bulk of the obligation will be borne by the central government.
Okay, which is pretty much what the economic survey had also suggested. So you are saying that a bulk of it will be centrally sponsored, and then perhaps the states can provide a matching grant.
Well, I'm not getting into details now. We are not in government today, so I'm not getting into the details. But as I said, the principle is we want states to share the responsibility of implementing the scheme. But the initiative and the major part of the responsibility will fall on the central government.
Okay. Let me ask you to comment on what were raised as issues with the idea of a universal basic income when Arvind Subramanian proposed it. The ideas, the arguments against a UBI, conspicuous spending, households, especially male members, may spend this additional income on wasteful activities. Of course, the moral hazard question, the gender disparity question, the implementation issues, something that Dr. Pranab Sen, who's on the program, also spoke of. He said that we've had a spectacular failures when it comes to successfully targeting and implementing such schemes, and of course the fiscal cost of a program like this if the government were to eventually consider winding it up. How would you respond to some of these concerns and these arguments that were used against the idea of a UBI?
You can always find arguments against an idea. I believe this is the time to implement the idea. When Maganrega was introduced, it was severely criticized. In fact, some people said that if they come to power, they'll wind up Maganrega. But eventually what happened? The worst critics, the severest critics embraced Maganrega, because Maganrega was one instrument, however imperfect it may be, to ensure that nobody goes to bed hungry. But we find that Maganrega has a utility, but it's not as useful as we think it should be to wipe out poverty. Maganrega perhaps keeps hunger away. But we have to go beyond that. Poverty is not only not having food on the table. Poverty is not having minimum clothes to wear. Poverty is not having a roof over your head. Poverty is not able to send your children to school. Poverty is not being able to access minimum health care. So while other initiatives will be there, the one way to wipe out poverty is to ensure that the poorest of India have a certain minimum income. It's in fact a way of, in fact it's an extrapolation of the minimum wage principle. Just as a minimum wage ensures that nobody falls below the poverty line, a minimum income for a family ensures that the family does not fall below the poverty line. So if you look at that analogy, things will become clearer. And that minimum income can be provided. Of course, there will be difficulties in implementation. Therefore, all the critics will be asked to join in devising the scheme and help us implement it. If Dr. Pranab Sen has got some difficulties, some questions, he will be the first to be invited to tell us how to get over those difficulties, and we'll ask him to join us in implementing the scheme.
Okay, one quick question, and I don't know...
I don't think anybody, just a moment. Yes. I don't think anybody can oppose the idea, or anybody will oppose the idea, that we have to give every family in this country a minimum income which will keep them above the poverty level.
Yes, I understand the emancipatory value that you're talking about, sir. I want to very quickly get another clarification, and I think I've asked you this question previously as well. Is this going to mean redrawing of the current subsidy arrangement? And again, if you come to power, because if we look at the subsidy bill, food subsidy about 1.7 lakh crore rupees, petroleum about 25,000 crore rupees, fertilizer 70,000 crore rupees, the total subsidy bill almost 2.9 lakh crores. Would you look at redrawing any of the current subsidies once you decide to roll this out, if you were to come to power?
Well, I can't. I won't be able to go into specifics. This is a collective decision of the new government. It may be a coalition government. We'll have to take the coalition partners on board. But whatever needs to be done has to be done to ensure that no family in India is below the level of poverty. Whatever needs to be done will be done. Whatever other subsidies have to be continued in order to address specific problems will have to continue. For example, we've got ICDS, that's a subsidized program. Now, ICDS has certain specific objectives. If those objectives have to be achieved, ICDS has to be continued and strengthened. I'm only giving an example. So if there are other subsidies that are intended to achieve other objectives, obviously they'll have to continue. So we'll work out the math when we are in government. I think it's too early to answer detailed questions. We are now putting forward an idea whose time has come. 70 years after independence, we cannot, we should not allow any family, which includes obviously the members of the family, to go below the poverty line. Everybody has to be assured an income which will keep them above a poverty line as we define it.
So let me, you said it's an idea whose time has come. Surjit Bhalla's point is that you have decided to, and I'm using the politically correct word, borrow this idea from the BJP, import this idea from the BJP. You're trying to steal the thunder of the BJP because the BJP perhaps is all set to announce a minimum support scheme for small and marginal farmers, or perhaps even farmers in general. So Surjit's point is that you've decided to up the game.
Just keep your question short, Shireen. Keep your question short, please. I don't think Surjit Bhalla is any longer a member of the Economic Advisory Council. So how is he privy to what the government is going to do? What we read in the newspapers is government is going to borrow or copy the Telangana model and transfer a certain amount of money to each farmer per acre of land he or she holds. But the Telangana model has been criticized by eminent economists because in the Telangana model, the money goes to the landlord. It goes to the absentee landlord living in Hyderabad and other cities. So I'm not criticizing the Telangana model. It's a model that serves a purpose, but there are serious questions about that model. If the government wants to follow that model, they're welcome to do so. But please don't decry our idea by saying we are borrowing from the BJP. In fact, I can say we have nothing to borrow from the BJP. The BJP is practically nothing to teach us.
Shireen?
We are doing this as part of our firm belief that the poorest in the country, the poor in this country, have the first right to the resources of this country. And therefore, 70 years after independence, while we have tried various methods to lift the economy, and the economy has grown tremendously since 1991 at any rate, the time has come to ensure that nobody, no family, no individual member of that family is below the poverty line. So we bring every family to a level of minimum income. Now I'd like to see what philosophical objection critics have to this idea.
My final question to you, Mr. Chidambaram, before we let you go, you said that if you were to come to power and roll this out, you will get the math in order. I think the concern really is, what is this going to mean as far as the fisc is concerned? Will there once again be the pressure as far as the revision of the FRBM is concerned, which is something that the Congress has been guilty of doing in the past?
You got your facts wrong. Except in the aftermath of the international financial crisis of 2008, we have always kept the fisc under control and progressively brought down the fiscal deficit. Even after 2008, after 3 years of relaxing the fiscal deficit target, when I returned to the Finance Ministry, we brought down the fiscal deficit sharply, and when we handed over power to the next government, we had brought down the fiscal deficit sharply. Just look at the numbers. We brought it down to, I think, 4.5% or so. Therefore, The Congress is committed to the FRBM. We will remain under the limit of 3%. But in a growing economy, where the GDP continues to grow, keeping the fiscal deficit at no more than 3%, we will find the resources to fund this program.
Okay. Okay. One quick final question, sir, because reports suggest, okay, that's a promise, and that's an important promise that you're making here on CNBC TV 18, that you will stick to the FRBM limits. Quick question, sir. Reports suggest that the Congress is looking at between 1,200 to 1,500 rupees. Is that the sort of ballpark that you're working with? Is that the assumption in the calculations you've done?
No, I don't have any numbers in front of me. This is a collective decision that will be taken. I'm only explaining the philosophy. I'm explaining the principle behind the Congress President's announcement. Let me emphasize once again, we are adapting the principle of universal basic income to ensure that every family is brought to a level of income where we can say they are no longer poor.
All right, Mr. Chidambaram, we will leave it there. Appreciate you joining us to explain the rationale behind the promise being held out by Rahul Gandhi, the Congress President. Surjit Bhalla, I'll come to you first. You heard what the former Finance Minister had to say. Your response?
Yeah. You know, success has many mothers, and that's as it should be. For those interested, both on your program and the politicians, of all sides. I just published it's on my website, something called Targeted Basic Income, which actually answers all the questions that you asked, Mr. Chidambaram. Where will the money come from? How will it cost? How much will be the transfer to each? How much are the poor, etc. So one. Second, Arvind Virmani and I, former Chief Economic Advisor, wrote about this in detail about 2-3 years ago as to where the money would come from, how will it be financed, etc. So I'm very, very pleased that this thing is being now projected by the Congress or whoever as a brand new idea that they will implement. I've made these presentations to Mr. Chidambaram in the Finance Ministry for the last decade. I've been saying this every year. So I am actually one of the happiest people today that the Congress has finally come around to accepting a basic income idea. No, I'm being very genuine. This is, as you know, I've spent a lot of time,
and
a lot of research. I can
genuine
point to 50
and generous.
Documents. Fine.
And
point to 50 documents that I've written on this subject. So this is fantastic. You know, the point is, and including the line, this is an idea whose time has come. That's in my book last year, The New Wealth of Nations. So including a detailed calculation of this minimum income, etc. I've never been in favor of targeted
what is your calculation?
And
universal basic income. Very quickly, before I get the other guests in, Surjit, what is your calculation?
My calculation is that we need about, first of all, that they are 25% poor, which has, and I take by the World Bank intermediate poverty line of $3, not the 1.90, and it's about 2.8% of GDP that is needed, and it is targeted at the poor, which I now calculate are about 33% of the population, 25 to 30. So all the numbers are there. It's on the website. It's called Targeted Basic Income. So if you go on the web, you'll find it. And I'll be tweeting about it again. I have to leave now, but thank you very much. It's another engagement that I have to go to, but I apologize.
Thanks. No worries. Thanks very much, Surjit, for joining us. Zafar Islam, let me come to you now. Some would say that the Congress has stolen the BJP's thunder by making this promise ahead of what the BJP intends to do. There's been a lot of speculation on what can be announced by the government, perhaps in the vote on account. Your reaction?
See, Shireen, I heard Mr. Chidambaram. What a hollow argument he was making whenever you pose him a question. It is certainly a borrowed idea he heard it on the street, and his his master has made his announcement, his party chief has made an announcement somewhere, and he has to just cover up. It's an election gimmick, because everyone knows their track record. What Congress has done, Congress has given this slogan. It's an old slogan, or like you say, that old wine in new bottle. They have given this slogan of Garibi Hatao long back. And now he has become sensitive, people have become sensitized. They are looking very sensitive that they have to really do something for the poor. They were in the government. Only why? The economy has only stepped up now because they themselves confirmed, Mr. Chidambaram.
Okay. I understand your criticism, but Zafar, very quickly, I want to ask you, because Surjit Bhalla said that he got a WhatsApp saying that the government has already announced a minimum support scheme for farmers. I don't know which WhatsApp group this is, but you know, when can we see this announcement?
Well, I can't comment on that because it's a privilege of the government, and there's a discretion when if there's something which is to be announced, that they will announce. But all I can say, and I can confirm that the government definitely is very, very considerate when it comes to farmers, when it comes to poorer section of the society, the marginalized of the society, and definitely government will definitely come up with some scheme to ensure that their interest is safeguarded.
But are you, Zafar, is the government looking at Arvind Subramaniam's idea of universal basic income, or is it looking at a minimum income guarantee for the poorest of the poor, which is what the Congress has promised? Will you now go back perhaps to the idea of a universal basic income, which when it was introduced in the economic survey, the Finance Minister Arun Jaitley had said that it was not politically feasible?
Well, I can't comment what the government intends to announce, whether they're really working on it or whether they have to come up with something new. I mean, it is not for me to make any such comment ahead of what the announcement the government has planned to do, or they have no plan to do. But let me tell you one thing very clearly, that the idea which has been borrowed, and Mr. Gandhi has spoken about it, one thing which I must clarify what they were saying, and that the universe, whenever has been spoken about the universal basic scheme, and the universe in there was the poorer section of the society, the marginalized, and what they are talking about, same thing. So basically, they are just trying to copycat something with an idea which they feel that can be latched by people, but unfortunately for them, that everyone on the street knows that it is the government, it is the Prime Minister who is the real well-wisher of the poorer section of the society, and if some scheme will come up, if it does come, then the real architect is the Honorable Prime Minister.
Okay.